A specific part of our culture is the search for individuality or authenticity. A study was completed from 2000 to 2020 to investigate people's comfort and motivation to stand out or be different. The reason was to evaluate the impact of social media on people's willingness to be unique and authentic. The result of the study showed a shift towards conformity and self censorship. People are less willing to stand out, to express their own opinions, especially ones that are different from popular opinion or controversial. We seem to be more concerned with maintaining the status quo or social harmony and acceptance rather than personal authenticity. In this episode, we're going to be discussing how this aligns with a specific attribute of God. Welcome to the He So I Project, brought to you by Redeeming Identity. This is the podcast where we are searching to know who God is so that we can find out who He has created us to be. I am your host, Dr. Eric Moyer. I am an author, I am a researcher, but I am also joined by my good friend, Pastor Eric Miller. And we are here to just have a great conversation and have you join us in that. So, hello, Eric.
Hello, Eric.
I've always been an individual that has kind of stood out in my life. Just physically, I'm 6 foot tall. As you can tell, I wear glasses, but I've been wearing these since I was in 4th grade. So you can imagine the picking I got on that one. But one of the times that I think I stood out more than any other time in my life was whenever I had the opportunity to go to Asia for a trip where I spent about a week and a half on a university campus and just getting to talk to individuals who were in their education program about the education program in Asia. And here I am, 6'2" of me, 6 foot, used to be 6'3", I'm now 6'2", and white as can be, and American as can be, in this Asian campus and walking around and sticking out like a sore thumb. It was a very interesting experience being different, standing out. Have you ever had a circumstance like that? I know that you've had at least one.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll just piggyback off of what you said, because that's probably the easiest thing to do in terms of going to a different culture as a tall. I'm also 6 foot, 6'3" still. Maybe I'll move to 6'2" eventually, but 6'3" right now. And having the blessing of being able to go over to Rwanda and serve pastors over there and teach and make really good relationships. It has been awesome. And what you talk about, sticking out like a sore thumb. Well, I'm taller, and obviously I'm a white guy. Although there's not a difference spiritually in talking with the Rwandan pastors, there is very much a visual difference. So it's easy to locate me amongst the crowd.
It's kind of an interesting idea about standing out, being different. In psychology, what we find whenever we're talking about identity and identity development, most of the time and most of the impacts on how we develop our identity, it's not focused on being different. It actually is focused more on accepting and incorporating and making part of who you are, the cultural norms of that we live in, so that we can be accepted and can be part of the groups that we are around all the time. So this is why whenever you go into certain parts of the country, or even certain parts of a city that you may be in, you feel sometimes that you're going into a different culture and with a different set of rules and a different set of expectations and a different way of living, where everyone else in there thinks that that's normal.
Mm-hmm.
I remember taking someone whenever I lived up in the Philadelphia area and being on the Temple University campus, and people were like that I was with were amazed that people would like cross the city streets like almost anywhere. I mean, they would like walk out in between cars and just walk out and just it's like no cars are coming. We're just going to walk out across the street. A car is coming. Walk out to the street.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was like so completely far into the way that they were raised, in the way in where they were raised and how they were trained or raised to live, that they would never do that.
Right.
But to everyone that lived down there and that was down there on a regular basis, that was normal. That's what everyone did, and the drivers knew what to expect. The people walking knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this very interesting dynamic of how to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting moving from one area to another, and I know you've done that. You live in a very different place than you were raised. And for me, moving out from Ohio to Colorado, and just experiencing the difference between the Midwest and the West. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that I've talked about with other people that have moved to Colorado is not always, but in general, people are less friendly, which is very interesting. You'll be on a walk, and in Ohio, if you're on a walk and you make eye contact with someone, you say hello or wish them a good day, or it's seemingly, at least from my experience, much more connected. But in Colorado, many times people will look away. I know when I'm out jogging, I usually try to at least lift a hand. I'm breathing so heavily that I usually don't say hello, but I raise a hand and smile, and it's amazing. I mean, people won't look at you in the eye. They won't wave back. So yeah, there are those differences in culture that you don't even realize until you're in a different culture, which shows you that difference.
So that kind of gets us to what we're going to be talking about this week, which is one of what I consider, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but to me, it's one of the central attributes of God. And you see this term related to God almost consistently, especially through the Old Testament. And it's this idea of being holy, that God is holy, that he is holy. So people may be wondering, okay, what does this have to do with like being in different cultures and standing out and all that? So how do you define being holy or God being holy?
Wow. I appreciate you just like laying into such an easy question early on in the podcast. It is almost defined by what it is not as much as it is what it is. I would say holiness is a defining, if not the defining attribute of God. It represents his separateness from his creation, his independence from his creation, his moral perfection, his so many things that come to mind, because it is such a defining characteristic of God that he is different than us. And I think if you talk about God's eminence and his transcendence, and this is the beauty of Jesus, is that God, who is holy, other, separate, chose to send his son into the world, that we not only have a transcendent, holy, inapproachable God, but we also have an eminent God. And so the beauty of the gospel is that God in no way, shape, or form compromised his moral perfection and holiness by putting on flesh and becoming like us, and even taking on sin. Even then, he became a sacrifice for sin, but did not become sinful. And so his holiness was maintained. Now, you asked a very simple question in some ways, and I'm already talking too much, but it's one of those things that is it is so amazing that if I talked in several more chapters and books, I would not be able at all to touch how big of a concept that is. So I'm going to stop there, knowing that there's much more to be said, but God's perfection, His moral perfection, and His otherness, His separateness, I think is probably some of the most important dimensions that come to mind.
Yeah, I agree with you. First off, that to me, out of all the attributes that we may talk about on this project as we go along, I wanted to start with this one. Besides God being the creator, which we talked about last time, but Him being God being holy, to me is so central, is so, it, like you said, it is who He is. It is, whenever we talk about an attribute, a characteristic, an identity of who God is, this is so encapsulating of who He is.
Mm-hmm.
So that as we talk about His holiness, it lays a further foundation of us being able to talk about all of His other attributes as we continue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the one that, as you were saying it, and as I've thought about this and talked with other people about this, the easiest way for me to think about His holiness is this idea of Him being completely separate or different.
Mm-hmm.
He is set apart.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that we set Him apart, as He, just because of who He is set apart.
Mm-hmm.
He is different. He is completely wholly different from us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes Him so worthy. And so you get in Isaiah, where he has his vision, and it starts off with the cherubim or seraphim. I always forget which one.
Well, let's say
The
cherubim.
angels.
Yeah, the
Okay.
angels.
The
Yeah.
angels that are around His throne singing holy, holy, holy. And that is describing who God is. And you know this, but in the Bible, in whenever it was communicating in written form back in those days, they didn't have bold, they didn't have italics, they didn't have underline, they didn't have all these things where you could make the text blink at you because they want to emphasize it. The way they emphasized it was by saying it multiple times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the first time saying something is holy, that's good. Some second time is saying this is really true about the individual. If you say it 3 times, this is kind of like supreme. This is central. This is absolute type idea. So by saying that holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, the angels were basically describing a central nature attribute of who God is. And Isaiah's reaction to that tells us so much about what does it mean. Because his reaction was basically, I am standing in the presence of something that I have no purpose standing in front of.
Yeah, woe to me, I'm a man of unclean lips. Just the acknowledgement in light of God's holiness of His own condition, His own identity. I think John does the same thing when he recognizes who Jesus is, and he literally says, "Away from me, I'm a sinful man." Like he recognizes that he has no place or business being in the presence of a ferociously thrice holy God.
Right.
Yeah.
So as we think, and you started talking about this, is that His holiness as a central attribute of who He is, His separateness, His distinctiveness, it describes and goes into every part of who He is. And so what does that mean? I mean, what does that tell us about who He is? That He is holy, He's distinct, He's separate, He's unique. What does that mean for Him from our standpoint?
Well, let me do this first. I was just, as I said, John, it was actually Peter. Peter is the one, so just a little correction there.
I thought that you were talking about John in Revelation. So
okay. I was, of course,
there
I was.
See?
No, I was thinking about Peter aboard the ship telling John when Jesus tells him to haul in the cast. But another example, yeah, John falls face down. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
that was just at the revelation of who God is. And in
Mm-hmm.
Revelation 4, you have again the holy, holy, holy. And
Right.
Isaiah says the earth is full of his glory. And then, the angels are saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty who was, who is,
And
and
who
who,
is to come?
yeah. So you've got this attribute of God, which is unlike any other attribute, because nowhere else in Scripture that I'm aware of do you have God as love, love, love. God
Right.
is grace, grace, grace. Now
Mm-hmm.
these things are absolutely true of Him. They are
Right.
absolutely true of Him. But the thing that differentiates this one is it is, again, several places in Scripture where we get this three times, the thrice holy, like you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
the bold, the flashing, the underlined characteristics of God. And if we start with God's holiness, if we start with his otherness, and we see, instead of God being just a hyper bigger, larger version of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
if we see God as someone who is actually completely different than who we are,
Mm-hmm.
then we begin to get an idea. Again, the more we know of God, the more we know of ourselves. So if we see God as other than who we are, completely different,
Mm-hmm.
completely perfect, He's never made a mistake in eternity, ever. And then we see ourselves. There's no great knowing of self without knowing of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the more we understand his holiness and how that separates him from his creation, it separates him from even our understanding of who we are, because we're so imperfect. It almost immediately sets up a chasm that, wow, if he is this and I am not that, then how do I relate to this holy God? There has to be some kind of intermediary. There has to be some connection between myself, and who is not holy,
Mm-hmm.
and this holy God.
That is absolutely true. And I know exactly where you're going with this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, but I'm going to go back, take a step back, because I think you talked about this in your description, is that one of the big aspects of God being holy is that God is perfect. And you said
mm-hmm,
that you said that he's never made a mistake, he's never made a wrong choice, he's never done anything that was not absolutely right. The other way that I think we use this term, and we'll talk about this much later, but that God is righteous,
mm-hmm,
meaning that he everything that he has done is in perfect alignment with who he is. He has never done anything that is different or separate or in conflict with who he is
right.
and who he always has been. Um, but then I think the other part is you talked about him being transcendent, which I think is great. Is this idea that there is this world that we live in, and then there's this we transcend, and you hear this in religion so many times, is that our goal is to transcend, or to live above this mortal idea. um but I think that idea of transcendence is that we're trying to reach something higher, and that's God. I mean,
Mm-hmm,
that's what we're trying to do. Is he is the ultimate in separate in what we're trying to do. Now, we're not trying to be God. We need to make sure that we're correct, but that it is that there is that distinction, and I think that you said it really well. It's not a physical distinction, even though there is a little bit of that. I mean, we're mortal, he's spiritual. There's another distinction there,
mm-hmm,
but the greater distinction is in who we are.
mm-hmm,
Is that he is who he is. He's holy. He's perfect. Everything that he does is in perfect unity. He is self-existent. He is complete in everything that he does, and we are not. We are so flawed.
mm-hmm,
And I think the part that I find interesting is that the two can't coexist to a degree. So we go back to Moses on the mountaintop, and he sees the burning bush, where the God's name, the I am Yahweh, is shared with Moses. But before that, he says, "Take off your shoes because you are on
holy ground."
So God is holy, and anything associated, related, and used by Him because of its connection to God becomes holy. So God, because of His presence in the burning bush, talking to Moses, the surrounding region, just because of His presence, became holy, and it needed to be treated differently.
Well, and you alluded to this so well previously, is that we get this sense of God's holiness from the Old Testament. Not that it's devoid in the New Testament at all, but I love that all that came before Christ points to Christ. And so we get this idea that even when God was in the tabernacle, there were places that people could not go because God's holiness needed to be maintained. And then when there was the permanent structure of the temple, there was multiple rooms to prevent people from getting close to the holiness of God, so His holiness would not be compromised. So you had what was known as the holy, the outer room, and then you had the Holy of Holies.
Right.
And so all of this, it communicated in physical terms a spiritual separation between us and the holiness of God. And that holiness, when we understand it, that perfection, and Eric, as you were talking about it, that He has never made a mistake. He's never had a wrong thought. He's never had a wrong action. He is totally in integrity with Himself. And that purity, that holiness is, first of all, I mean, we could sing worship for the rest of the podcast, because just imagining how awesome our God is, like that for me, of the many reasons there is to worship God, but to have something that is so majestic in His holiness, that the God that we know and serve is worthy of our whole lives, and that holiness is part of it. That He is so completely other, and that we even have these physical representations of that otherness, and yet, and I'm not trying not to jump the gun here, so you rein me back, but yet He wants relationship.
Right.
So even that we are characterized by unholiness in our corrupted identity. We are characterized by, instead of integrity, that our identities are disintegrated. And yet He made a way for us to have a relationship with Him, even in the Old Testament, that there is a pursuing of this holy God, of His creations who are not holy.
I think it goes back to what we talked about just a little bit ago, where I was saying that anything that is related, anything that is associated, anything that belongs to, let me put that way, anything that belongs to God, in a way inherits or reflects or is also described in His holiness. So you see angels. We'll just use angels because people go there, but they are servants of God. An angel shows up and people fall on their faces. And it's not, and they always have to tell people, don't worship me because I'm not God.
Right.
But that's just such a small glimpse of God's holiness. They're just reflecting, in a way, God's holiness or His brilliance, that people just kind of go, okay, I'm done. I'm out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because we are so unholy, because this is not what we were created for. We were created to be in relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the unholiness, the thing that keeps us, that seems to be the thing that keeps us so separate from him, from his holiness, is our own choices, our own identity. That our identity is corrupted, and that corruption separates us from him. But part of that corruption is because we are separate from him.
Yeah. Well, I think in so many places, God is so good to give us metaphors that we can understand.
Yeah.
And part of that is in John chapter 1, talking about the light has come into the world.
Right.
And there's this idea of light driving out darkness,
Mm-hmm.
that there is a relationship between light and darkness. And darkness is the absence of light. So once light is introduced, it has to, by design, chase away darkness. So God's holiness has an impact. God's holiness, it makes a difference. So to have an encounter with God, whether it be through one of his messengers, an angel, or like Moses and Elijah, where you have these encounters where God's like, you can't see me. I'm going to hide you away in the cleft of a rock, and I will allow my glory to pass by you. But I am so radically different and so holy that you can only just see the end of my holiness as it passes by.
If you think about that, just take that idea. Adam and Eve walked with God.
Mm-hmm.
So what were we created to be like? Where in the garden, we were able to walk with God, converse with him, relate with him, see him. But now we are, our identities, who we are, has been so corrupted that we can't even be in his presence without, I mean, he's like, if you saw me in all of my glory and all of my holiness, you would just drop down dead. So how corrupted, how changed are we from what we were created to be? That is the case. It's like, what was lost?
Oh, well, yeah, it is, I think it would be impossible to accurately describe in words what was lost at the fall.
Right.
I think that's the scandal of the beginning of human existence, is you go from this place of perfect relationship with God, an uncorrupted identity, a purpose that was clear and being able to be lived out, the right perspectives on things, the right priorities in life, all of those things balanced. And then in a moment, it so radically changed that there was introduced a fear of God. There was immediately a hiding from God. And yeah, it is hard to, because ultimately it's a journey back to the garden.
Right.
Is that ultimately, I mean, we know how the story ends if you've read through the end of the Bible and you get into Revelation, and what began in a garden will end in a city.
Right. And
that new city and the new relationship that we have with Christ, that new intimacy, which will be regained. So yeah, it's not an understatement to say that at that moment of the fall that we broke the universe, that the earth now suffers, and you can read in Romans about it, groans waiting to be delivered. So that the earth suffers. Our relationship with God was broken. Our relationship with others, our relationship with ourselves in terms of our identity, all of that was fractured. So much so that everyone who is now born into the world is born in Adam, into that corrupted identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that what we'd have done in our commonness, and I'm going to use the term because God in the Bible many times makes a distinction between the things that are holy and the things that are common.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our commonness, in our corruptedness, what we have done is we have tried to make the norm the corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gets to this idea that as we come back into Christ, okay, so Jesus lived the holy life. And I think that that's one thing that we miss sometimes is in God's eminence in Jesus, in that he came down to earth. He maintained his holiness. He maintained his separateness. He was completely distinct from every other person that has ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
Because he maintained his relationship with God throughout his entire life and lived out of his perfect identity, being the person that he was born to be and living out perfectly, reflecting who God is, which is what he said, which is what is said in John, is he came to show us who the Father is, to reflect to us, this is what God is like. And this is who we were created to be.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for joining us on the He So I Project podcast. In part 1, we have been spending time discussing a central attribute of God, his holiness. God is holy. In part 2, which will be coming, we will shift the discussion to answer the question, since God is holy, what does that mean for our identity? God is holy, so we can be what? You don't want to miss that discussion as we really focus in on continuing the discussion of God's holiness. But what does that mean as we see the redemption, the redeeming of our identity? Also, as you heard in this discussion, the concept of God's holiness is much more than we can completely discuss in the short podcast. So please visit redeemingidentity.com for a growing set of resources that we are putting together to help you as you study and as you look into God's Word to find out what does it mean for God to be holy, and so that you can also discover who you were created to be as you learn more about God and get to know who God is. We want to thank you for listening to the He So I Project podcast. This is produced by Redeeming Identity. We want to help people know who God is so that they can discover who they were created to be. We appreciate you joining us for this part 1 of the conversation, and we look forward to joining you again for part 2 as we continue this discussion. Please subscribe to this podcast so that you can be notified when new episodes are released, and also go look back at our archive of other discussions where we look at other attributes of who God is. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to joining you in our next discussion on the He So I Project podcast.